In 2025, the foreign policy of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina-Fasо, reflects a deep realignment not just of diplomatic ties but of ideological direction. Emerging from a wave of coups that reshaped the Sahel region and cast doubt upon the Western model of governance for many in West Africa, Traoré's administration has prioritized sovereignty, strategic independence, and regional solidarity over traditional reliance on former colonial powers. His foreign policy is shaped by a fierce commitment to reducing dependency on France and Western institutions while building new coalitions based on mutual respect, non-interference, and shared security challenges. The cornerstone of Traoré's foreign policy is the repositioning of Burkina Faso away from France and toward countries like Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and other members of the Global South. He frames this shift as a necessary emancipation from what he refers to as neo-colonial control, economic, military, and cultural. This realignment is not merely rhetorical, it has materialized in new military partnerships, energy deals, development aid, and diplomatic cooperation. One of the most publicized examples of this shift has been the burgeoning relationship with Russia. Traoré has met with Russian diplomats, military advisors, and eventually President Vladimir Putin to expand military cooperation in the fight against insurgency. The partnership includes not just weapons transfers but also training programs for Burkinabe soldiers, intelligence support, and, reportedly, a discreet presence of private military contractors. This partnership is strategically significant for both nations. Russia seeks to expand its influence in Africa as a counterweight to Western pressure, while Traoré seeks security assistance without lectures on democracy or conditional aid. Military cooperation is only one part of the broader picture. Traoré also seeks to diversify Burkina Faso's economic partnerships. In 2025, his administration has signed numerous memoranda of understanding with Chinese state-owned enterprises to develop gold mining operations, improve road and rail infrastructure, and build telecommunications networks. Chinese investment is welcome due to its scale and speed of implementation, but also because it is typically accompanied by non-interference in domestic politics. This model of state-to-state cooperation appeals to Traoré's broader vision of African autonomy, one rooted in strategic pragmatism rather than liberal ideology. Similarly, new trade routes and supply chains are being established with Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Brazil, focusing on agricultural imports, fuel, and construction expertise. One of the defining features of Traoré's foreign policy is his regional approach to diplomacy. He sees the Sahel not as a fractured battlefield of national borders but as a unified front in the war against terrorism, economic marginalization, and political instability. To this end, he has deepened alliances with the transitional governments of Mali and Niger, both of whom are also led by military figures who came to power through coups and share similar anti-Western sentiments. The three countries have formed what is commonly referred to as the Sahel Alliance, an informal but increasingly coordinated bloc that advocates for joint military operations, intelligence sharing, and a collective disengagement from ECOWAS, the West African regional body they view as biased and overly aligned with Western powers. The Sahel Alliance has begun hosting joint exercises, deploying shared counterinsurgency units, and even discussing a future shared currency to decouple from the CFA franc, a vestige of French financial control. This pivot has not come without challenges. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, faces diplomatic isolation from many Western governments and international institutions. Funding from the IMF and World Bank has been suspended or reduced. European Union aid programs are in a state of freeze. The United States has placed travel restrictions on key military leaders and warned of sanctions should the country further veer from a timeline toward democratic elections. But Traoré has not wavered. He presents these moves not as punishments, but as confirmations of his stance, that Burkina Faso must chart its own course, even if it means sacrificing short-term economic relief for long-term sovereignty. To compensate for lost aid, the administration is pursuing bilateral humanitarian and development partnerships with nations that share its geopolitical perspective. Iran, for instance, has offered medical aid and agricultural support. Venezuela has extended an offer of subsidized fuel, and Algeria has begun training Burkinabe engineers in renewable energy infrastructure. These steps are calculated to demonstrate that alternative partnerships exist outside of traditional Western-dominated systems. Traoré's foreign policy is also deeply ideological. He often frames his speeches with themes of anti-imperialism, Pan-African unity, and the necessity for a new global order rooted in respect for national sovereignty. In his addresses at international forums, such as the African Union Summit and the BRICS Plus consultative meetings, he emphasizes that Africa must no longer be treated as a passive recipient of development but as an active player with its own models, values, and strategic ambitions. This ideological stance has earned him a cult-like following among Pan-Africanist youth and intellectual circles, many of whom see in him a resurgence of the revolutionary spirit once embodied by leaders like Tomasa Sankары and Patrice Lumumba. Traoré skillfully blends this ideological narrative with modern statecraft, arguing that resisting Western pressure is not a rejection of globalization, but a restructuring of it on more equitable terms. Meanwhile, his administration is working to modernize the diplomatic apparatus. New embassies and consulates have opened in Asia and Latin America, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has launched a recruitment drive to bring in young, multilingual diplomats who can represent Burkina Faso's interests abroad in new languages and venues. International media relations are also a priority. Government-affiliated news agencies have begun publishing multilingual content aimed at portraying Burkina Faso's policies as rational responses to historical injustice rather than reckless nationalism. This diplomatic overhaul also includes efforts to mobilize the Burkinabe diaspora. The government has offered tax incentives and repatriation programs for professionals willing to return and invest in key sectors like healthcare, education, and agribusiness. Traoré's foreign policy also has a strong humanitarian component. The security crisis in the north and east of the country has displaced hundreds of thousands. In 2025, his administration began a multi-track initiative involving foreign NGOs and sovereign partners to develop mobile clinics, refugee camps, and community reintegration projects. Countries like India and Indonesia have contributed resources to these efforts, and Traoré has invited international observers to monitor the use of aid, framing it as an exercise in transparency on Burkina Faso's own terms. Simultaneously, he has made it clear that humanitarian assistance should never be used as a tool of political pressure. In one televised address, he stated, "We welcome friendship, not paternalism. We welcome help, not control." The focus on climate diplomacy is also a relatively new but increasingly prominent aspect of his foreign policy. Recognizing the desertification and water scarcity that threaten the livelihoods of millions in the Sahel, Traoré has launched appeals for international cooperation on climate resilience. He has endorsed the Great Green Wall Initiative and begun talks with Scandinavian and East Asian countries on sustainable agriculture, water conservation, and solar energy expansion. These initiatives are pitched not as charity but as partnerships that offer mutual benefit in an era of global climate disruption. Burkina Faso has even hosted its own regional summit on Sahelian climate strategy, inviting scientists, NGOs, and government officials to chart a unified course of action. In cultural diplomacy, Traoré's government has invested in initiatives to promote Burkinabe art, film, music, and heritage abroad. Leveraging the country's rich tradition of cinema, particularly through the FESPACO Film Festival, Burkina Faso has sent cultural ambassadors to Latin America and Southeast Asia, creating platforms for dialogue that transcend traditional politics. These efforts are supported by international cultural organizations and serve to reinforce a narrative of a proud, independent, and creative African state rising on the global stage.